Scott just said something really interesting. I want to double check that I got this right. Only 31% of voters were really keeping track of the Trump trials?
Now, this is the number after the verdict and with all of the weekend barrage of news.
Wow.
Remember, the week before, only 18% were paying attention, and I'd expect the number will go back down over the next week or so. What's really important to recognize about this, among voters who aren't committed to Trump or Biden, only 11% are following news of this. So it's not something that is going to be swaying a lot of people.
We're going to have more on this later in the broadcast. And by the way, unless otherwise noted, all the polls cited in the show are conducted by Scott's firm, RMG Research. We've worked together for so long, and what I have always loved about Scott is that his polls are fair, they're accurate, so you get information that you really can use. And speaking of information, it's time for your thoughts. What do you have on mind today?
The presidential race was close before Donald Trump's conviction in a New York courthouse. Just over a week has gone by, and well, most analysts share my view that it's likely to remain very close. In other words, that conviction probably doesn't have much of an impact. To make the point, my firm, RMG Research, had conducted some polling, and we finished surveys just before the verdict was announced. 51% of voters at that time believed that Donald Trump was less ethical than most politicians. Then there was a barrage of news coverage over the weekend, and guess what? Nothing changed. After all that news coverage, after the verdict, 50% said he was less ethical than most politicians. What about the horse race? Well, our last polling before the verdict showed it was a tie among registered voters, 42% for Trump, 42% for Biden. After the verdict, 43% for Trump, 41% for Biden. Again, no real change, just statistical noise. The Los Angeles Times took a look at this and wrote that a lot of people, especially many liberal Democrats, consistently have had trouble wrapping their mind around that basic fact. How can a criminal conviction not sink the campaign of Donald Trump? Now, the Times suggests the problem is probably low information voters. The Times story acknowledges that most voters are committed to their own partisan camp. They're either red or blue. But swing voters, well, they're not really paying attention. So the Times assumes that as they hear the news, maybe a Biden bounce should be expected as people begin to let this sink in. Apparently, the thinking is that low information voters will eventually learn of the conviction and they will turn away from Trump. Now, that might be the case. After all, we are in uncharted territory here. Nobody really knows how this will play out. But there's another angle to the low information voter narrative. Republicans overwhelmingly see the Trump trial as part of an ongoing abuse of government power designed to stop Donald Trump. And that surprises Democrats. They can't understand the cynicism about the process. Now, it may be that Democrats see this because their preferred media outlets have shielded them from some very inconvenient truths. For example, Republicans are well aware that Hillary Clinton's campaign paid for the dossier that led to the Russia collusion narrative. Now, it was a fake dossier, it was leaked to the media, and it led to a special prosecutor whose sole objective was to investigate President Trump. Well, despite the facts and surrounding that situation, only 21% of Democrats are aware that the Clinton campaign paid for that dossier. Well, what about the social media censorship on stories about Hunter Biden's laptop? You know, the New York Post broke a big news story just before the 2020 election. It was potentially damaging to Joe Biden. But the Post's social media accounts were blocked. So were people who tried to share the story. And you know, even to this day, 4 years later, just 23% of Democrats know that that is true. So what does this mean for low information voters? Well, it's possible that what the Times expects will happen. It's also possible that as they learn more, they'll hear a different part of the story. If these voters learn why half the nation thinks that the trial was merely a political attack, well, that could hurt Biden rather than help him. Look, the point here is the race is close. Nobody knows whether the hush money convictions will have any impact at all. We'll have to wait a few weeks until the initial hubbub dies down and we get a good sense of where this is trending. But right now, the most likely result is the conviction of Donald Trump won't have an impact. Perceptions of the economy and border security will almost certainly play a bigger role in determining our next president. Those are my thoughts.
You know, Scott, I just don't think that we're low info voters. I think we got bigger fish to fry. I mean, what we care about, what I care about, eggs. Have you seen the cost of eggs or flour or sugar? My kids are going, are we ever in pancakes again for breakfast? Right. That's what Americans care about. Our life, what happens in it.
And that's the problem I have with the whole term low information voters. It's just their focus is on something different. It is condescending, and there is more to life than politics. I know there's a lot of people in Washington that don't believe that, but it's the rest of life that really matters. And that's where we end up in these discussions where people in Washington, people in the political bubble are misunderstanding what's going on. What we learned in the New York trial wasn't anything new about President Trump. There was no news in there, no surprise. Most voters thought that he was going to be found guilty, whether they thought it was fair or not. About a third thought he'd already been convicted. So despite the enormous coverage and despite the labeling of this as historic, it wasn't really news.
No. The news? The price of eggs. That's what it gets back to. What can we expect, Scott, from the Electoral College this November?
Well, Edie, let's start with basics. People tend to make the Electoral College discussion more complicated than it has to be. A whole bunch of states, flyover country.
The givens.
Yeah, these are the givens. Donald Trump is almost certain to win these states in the Electoral College. Gets him to 218. He needs 270 to win.
And what about President Biden?
President Biden, he has the coasts. He gets to 211 Electoral College votes. So what you're seeing is this is a very close race in the Electoral College. Now, we can add a little bit of nuance to it.
Yeah, now this is interesting because I covered politics in Minnesota, lived up in Duluth, and to see that as a light blue is sort of surprising to me, although there's a large pro-Palestinian population there.
Yeah, now, Minnesota is one of the temptations of the Republican Party. They always think they'll do well there, especially if they're doing well in Wisconsin. But it's been more than 50 years since Minnesota went for Republican. So this will be a shot, but it's still close enough. Donald Trump came very close in 2016. Could happen. If you go to New Hampshire, you have a similar type of dynamic where you're in a situation where this is a state that we'd expect to go to the Democrats, but it's kind of close. It's not really clear. So at this point, we're now at 225 for Biden, 219 for Trump.
And I see a lot of stuff here still empty.
Right.
Okay.
And when you go here, 7 yellow states. These are the toss-ups. These are the states that are likely to determine who our next president is. First thing about this, Edie, and we've talked about this before, these are very close races. In Arizona, 4 years ago, Joe Biden won it by just over 10,000 votes out of 3.3 million.
I mean, a fairly tiny amount, which could be impacted by almost anything, the weather.
Right, and that's one of the keys here. You know, we say the trials or other specific things don't have a big impact, but any impact can be the difference. In Nevada, we had 1.5 million votes cast, 33,000 vote difference. So these races are all very close. But if you look at all of the polling and the demographics and the analysis that's being done, most people, most pundits would say that the 4 southern states here,
Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, another one really close, 11,000 votes
out
separating
of 5
them.
million.
Yeah.
People would say these states are pretty close, you know, but they're leaning in Donald Trump's direction. So let's see what happens at this point. So if we were to assume, as people expect, that Donald Trump were to win Nevada.
As it's leaning now.
As it's leaning now, no guarantees. And by the way, these hashtags reflect a state that flipped. It was a blue state 4 years ago, so if Trump were to win it, it would flip. Then we go to Arizona. What if that begins to move into Trump territory? Okay. And Edie, why don't you drive here, take care of Georgia?
Georgia, we add in another.
Yeah, and then North Carolina. And by the way, North Carolina, not quite as competitive as the other states. Democrats continue to believe, this is almost in a sense like Minnesota. Democrats continue to believe they're more competitive there, but it's likely to end up in the Republican column. So when you do all this, look where Donald Trump is. 268 Electoral College votes.
That looks like close but no cigar.
It does. and by the way, in 2016, what we saw was it was easy to get Donald Trump to 263 Electoral College votes. And guess what? It all came down to the same type of dynamic. There were 3 states right here in the Midwest. Those 3 states were the ones that Joe Biden had to win, or Donald Trump had to win at least one of the 3. That's where we are today.
Okay, so let's look at Wisconsin.
Yeah, Wisconsin, 20,000 vote difference out of 3.3 million votes. When you talk about Michigan, the margin was a little bit bigger there, 154,000 votes.
But that, again, is one of those states with a large pro-Palestinian population, which could impact the Biden vote.
And remember, Donald Trump only has to win one of these 3 to go over the top. And Pennsylvania, fewer than 100,000 votes out of about 7 million. What this is telling us is this is a very close election. And just to make the point, let's assume—
do the math for me.
Do the math. Well, let's look at Wisconsin first.
Okay.
If Wisconsin were to go to the Democrats, he gets a little bit closer.
All right.
Then we do Michigan. Well, guess what? He's getting pretty
closer,
close.
Okay.
And then if you do Pennsylvania, no. If this were to happen, we would have Joe Biden with 269 Electoral College votes, Donald Trump with 268. Nobody's at 270.
This is the new math. It could be really close.
Right. And the difference is Nebraska has a situation where Donald Trump was likely to win the state, but Joe Biden could win one district.
That's the Omaha district?
In Omaha, right. And if that were to happen, well, then Joe Biden, if everything else happened in the math, Joe Biden would barely win. But if it went the other way, guess what? We're right now back to a tie. The House of Representatives will decide it. Edie, I don't expect this.
Does this keep you up at night?
No, I don't expect this to happen. You know, this is the kind of thing political scientists would love to talk about, but not so likely a scenario because no matter how you look at it, this race is close. This map won't be perfect no matter how we design it. Let's watch what happens in the next couple of months. And by the way, you know, there's not just a presidential race this year. In a few weeks, we're going to be back taking a look at the Senate map. Take a look at all of the races there that are in play this election because control of the Senate very much at stake.
Congress fighting for the truth, trying to figure out exactly what did Dr. Fauci know, what did the government know, and how they handle the COVID-19 pandemic, properly or not. It's time for Rasmussen's Roundup.
And Edie, the truth is Dr. Fauci is a very polarizing personality in American politics. 46% say they have a favorable opinion of him, 41% unfavorable. This reflects a divide we have seen since the earliest days of the pandemic. Republicans and Democrats have looked at this issue differently, and that infects every answer on this discussion.
You know, I always got the feeling like they were kind of just going by the seat of their pants. But instead of saying, we're really not sure, here's our best guess, they tried to be the know-it-alls. You know, here's the truth, here's this. And then they had to keep on changing it, which it does kind of make you go, well, you know, are you really telling me the truth?
Right.
And I think that's the feeling you get with voters.
I think that's fair. You know, 61% of voters believe the government intentionally released misleading information during the pandemic. Not that they made a mistake, they intentionally released misleading data. And where you began to see that fairly early, you know, the CDC would have these big changes, you know, that they would announce in their standards. Nobody was paying attention to them. Most voters believe that the pandemic actually began in a lab in Wuhan. Now, we don't know that for sure, but that has been a deeply held belief of a lot of Americans for a long time. But not only that, 57% of voters think that our government officials worked to help China to cover up the lab leak.
Yeah, well, I think that's part of what Congress is trying to figure out here. But again, you know, you had people that said, I think Dr. Fauci himself, that said, oh no, it can't be the lab leak, and then said, well, it can't be ruled out. Well, you know, that is what makes people feel, I think, uncomfortable about the government. So it's probably good for us as a nation to try to get to the bottom of this.
Right. And, you know, this is a case where maybe different states trying things made sense because, first of all, you learn from that. Second of all, every state's a little bit different. You know, rural Wisconsin is different than Manhattan.
Yeah, I mean, here, I'm in Texas. You put on your mask when you go to the Home Depot and you go to the H-E-B grocery store because everybody's got to go there. But when you go out to the bar or the dance hall, I'm not putting a mask on. If you think you're going to get sick, stay home. Dance alone.
Dance alone. That wasn't a big part of the campaign. I don't remember that.
According to brand new polling by Scott's firm, RMG, 61% of voters believe that at least some of the information that the federal government told us during the pandemic was intentionally false and misleading. It's a number that's kind of indicative of the American attitude toward trust in our government. And trust is a topic that came up in the mailbag this week because we love your questions. We want you to be a part of the show here. And so we invite you to scan the QR code. It's showing on the bottom part of your screen right now. You just follow that link to a webpage. You can ask Scott pretty much anything you want. And how does Scott conduct polls? That's a great one. He's got a couple questions from the viewer mailbag already that caught our team's attention. One viewer said, how can I get in the poll?
You know, the answer is you can't get in a poll by signing up somewhere. I mean, think about it this way. Imagine if Fox News had all of their viewers answering a poll and then CNN had all their viewers answering a poll. You know what? The results are going to be entirely different and meaningless because that's a sample that you have that doesn't represent the nation. So the truth is you have to be randomly selected.
Now, something I told y'all earlier was what I love about your polling is that it's been so accurate over year after year after year. But so one of the viewers also asked, you know, when I look at a poll, how do I know what I'm looking at and that I can trust it?
You know, there's a lot of people who don't trust polls, and I'm not even offended by
bad.
That. Well, there's problems. There's lots of issues with particular polls. But this is a topic that I think deserves a little more attention than we have time for in a mailbag. Next week, I'll make this my monologue topic. I'll go into talking about, you know, why should you trust polls? What should you look for? What should you be on guard for? And also address many of the concerns that people have.
Other news, former President Donald Trump joined TikTok. Did you know that? In just a couple of days, he had millions of followers. So how do Americans in general feel about TikTok and national security?
You know, just over half of voters say that they think it's a problem, that TikTok is a threat to our national security. This is one of those questions, though, you want to be a little careful about over-interpreting because most Americans aren't on TikTok. Younger people are on it, but you got a lot of older people answering these questions who aren't really sure what it is, and they're a little bit suspicious of social media in general. So basically, people who use TikTok are more supportive of the platform than those who aren't.
So, Scott, we looked at a lot of important issues this week, and we've got great stuff coming up for you, including the Senate, Electoral, college map, and all that. But what is the number not to forget this week?
The number not to forget, only 31% of voters right now are following news of the Trump trials very closely. And among those who are uncommitted in the presidential race, only 11% are paying attention. That's it for this week on the Scott Rasmussen Show. Stay connected with us all through the week. For Edie Hill and the entire team that put this program together, I'm Scott Rasmussen. America, have a great week.